In the middle of a mid-air collision, the crews got a few seconds they should never have had. Their two aircraft had locked together and pitched upward, and as they did, the airspeed bled away, and with it went the crushing load that pins a body into its seat during any hard maneuver. For a moment, the crews were light in their harnesses, light enough to raise an arm, light enough to reach the ejection handle. That opening is the only reason four hands ever found four handles. And by everything we know about a low-altitude collision, it had no business being there. That opening came out of a catastrophe. Two EA-18G Growlers, more than 20 tons each, nearly 28,000 pounds of jet fuel between them, enough to flatten a city block, struck each other over an airshow crowd and fell to the ground, still tangled together. 4 people were inside. The aircraft did not survive. All 4 did. That is not luck, and it is not a miracle. A miracle would mean there was no mechanism, and here there were 3, each harder to believe than the last. Fuel torn into open air with every reason to burn, and it didn't. An airframe already coming apart that still held its shape a moment longer than destruction should allow. Ejection seats that fired into a sky no one ever certified them for. Not one of the 3 was built for this collision. What turned 3 unrelated systems into 4 survivors was the order in which they were allowed to fail. Those few seconds to reach a handle were only the last of them. The crash is not the story. The story is the sequence, the exact order in which the machine was allowed to come apart, because that order is the whole difference between a wreck no one walks away from and this one. And that is what classified Decoded exists to decode, the order of failure. To understand how the crews got those few seconds, we have to go back to before the collision, to who was flying and why they were flying close enough to touch. The squadron was VAQ-129, the Vikings, and the precision matters here because it settles the obvious objection before it is raised. VAQ-129 is not a deploying combat unit. It is the Navy's fleet replacement squadron for the Growler, the schoolhouse that trains every Growler pilot and every electronic warfare officer in the Navy, the Marine Corps, and Allied air arms before they reach the fleet. It also flies the Growler demonstration team, so the 2 crews holding that formation were not careless, and they were not amateurs caught out of their depth. They were among the most practiced Growler aviators alive, flying a profile they had rehearsed hundreds of times. That is exactly what makes the collision worth taking apart. When the people least likely to make a mistake end up in a midair anyway, the useful question is no longer who was at fault. It is what was working against them that no amount of skill can fully cancel. Something that lives inside every tight formation ever flown, and wakes up the instant 2 aircraft trade miles of separation for feet. It has a name and a number, and to see how hard it can push even them, we start at the collision itself. A Growler in demonstration trim weighs somewhere around 48,000 pounds, lighter than a full combat load. Still, more than 20 tons of aluminum, titanium, and fuel. Its 2 F414 engines can push it past Mach 1.6, and in a formation pass, it flies within feet of another machine identical in every dimension. That proximity is the entire point of a demonstration. It is also the trade. Everywhere else in military aviation, we spend enormous effort keeping high-performance aircraft apart. Miles of separation, altitude blocks, radar deconfliction, timing. A formation demonstration deletes all of that on purpose. The cameras need both jets in one frame. The crowd needs to see the geometry. Separation measured in miles becomes separation measured in feet. And once 2 aircraft are only feet apart, the quantity that rules them is not speed. It is closure rate, the speed at which the gap between them is collapsing. Closure rate has nothing to do with how fast either jet is going, and everything to do with how fast the distance between them is disappearing. If the trailing aircraft is overtaking the leader by just 10 knots, a difference no spectator on the ground could see, and one the pilot himself might never consciously feel, the gap between them is shrinking at roughly 17 feet per second. At a conservative formation speed of 300 knots, 50 feet of separation can vanish in under a tenth of a second. Now set that against the machine doing the reacting. A simple human reflex, light hitting the eye and the hand moving, takes at least 150 milliseconds. Recognizing that a closure threat exists, deciding what to do about it, and actually moving a control surface adds a good fraction of a second on top of that. At feet of separation, that fraction of a second is time. That does not exist. None of this is a failure of airmanship. It comes down to a mismatch of speeds. How fast a human nervous system can process a threat against how fast two metal airframes erase the space between them. Training sharpens the first. It cannot touch the second. There is one more factor that lives inside every formation, whether or not it decided this one. Wake turbulence. Every wing sheds two counter-rotating vortices off its tips, spinning outward and down. At the low speeds and high angles of attack of a demonstration pass, those vortices are at their most violent, and the aircraft in trail is flying straight into the disturbed air the leader left behind. A sudden, unexpected roll from an invisible vortex can erase a safe gap before a pilot registers that anything has changed. The investigators will determine what role, if any, it played over Idaho. What physics can say is only that the ingredient was present, exactly as it was in 1966, when an F-104 starfighter was caught in the wake of an XB-70 Valkyrie and pulled into the bomber before it could recover. The collision happened. What it set in motion is the rest of this story. When two aircraft weighing tens of thousands of pounds strike each other at flying speed, the energy released is enormous. Metal shears. Sealed fuel systems that were holding pressure a moment earlier are suddenly open to the air. Inside each Growler sits nearly 14,000 pounds of jet fuel, 2 aircraft. On paper, that is the energy content of a very large bomb, and it was now exposed. None of it detonated in the air. The reason is a distinction that sounds like a technicality and turns out to be the difference between a memorial and a recovery. Jet fuel does not explode, it burns. And burning is a far fussier thing to arrange. An explosive releases its energy in microseconds through a chemical chain reaction that sustains itself once it starts. A combustible liquid releases energy only when 3 conditions arrive together. The fuel has to be broken into a mist fine enough to mix with air. That mist has to meet a source of ignition. And the fuel has to be above its flash point, the temperature at which it gives off enough vapor to catch. Miss any one of the 3, and the fuel simply sits there. The Navy chose this particular fuel to make that convergence as hard as physically possible. JP5, the carrier fuel, has a flash point of at least 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That number is not an accident of chemistry. It is a decision written in the history of flight deck fires. A deliberate choice to carry a fuel that stays inert in almost every condition except a controlled burn inside an engine. The Air Force's land-based JP-8 flashes around 100 degrees. Automotive gasoline will flash well below freezing. It is the difference between a fuel you can drop a lit match into and watch go out, and one whose vapor is already waiting above the puddle for a spark. JP-5 was engineered to be the first kind, to do nothing at all when it is not supposed to. And then, the airflow finished the job. The fuel that escaped the ruptured tanks did not pool around a heat source. It emerged into the slipstream, a river of air moving hundreds of feet per second past the falling wreckage that tore the liquid apart and swept it away faster than it could gather into a burnable cloud near any spark. Every ingredient of a fire was loose in that sky. They were never loose in the same cubic foot at the same moment. The ground rewrote that equation completely. When the wreckage finally struck the earth, all 4 conditions converged at once. Tanks crushed flat, metal grinding against rock to throw sparks, hot engine sections supplying the heat. The fireball the spectators saw happened there, on impact, not 1 second before. That single second of separation, air versus ground, was the whole margin. But the chemistry only explains why nothing ignited. It does not explain why the airframe held together long enough for the fuel to get away in the first place. That belongs to the next link. Here's where the engineering stops being about chemistry and starts being about time. The Growler is built on the Super Hornet airframe, a structure certified to withstand 7.5 times the force of gravity, with that limit policed continuously by a fly-by-wire flight control system. Its mix of titanium, aluminum, lithium, and composite panels was chosen under a design philosophy called damage tolerance, and it runs almost backwards from instinct. The airframe is never meant to be indestructible. It is meant to come apart gradually rather than all at once, bending and tearing along paths the engineers mapped in advance instead of shattering. So the collision wrecked both structures. What it did not do was crush the fuel tanks in the first instant. That delay, the gap between deformed and destroyed, is exactly what gave the fuel time to disperse into the slipstream rather than pool. And that same delay set up the most improbable advantage in the whole story, one no engineer would ever design on purpose. Exactly how the two airframes snagged on each other is still for the investigation to settle. The aerodynamic consequence is not. When they locked together, they became a single object with its center of gravity in the wrong place and its lift distribution torn apart. The result was a violent pitch-up, and a nose-up attitude at low airspeed does exactly one thing. It destroys lift faster. The combined mass bled off speed, the nose rose, and both airframes fell into a stall. In almost any other flight regime, a stall at low altitude is the end of the account. Here, it was the thing that made survival physically possible. A stall is the moment lift collapses and airspeed falls towards zero. And when airspeed goes, the load it generates goes with it. The G-forces that had been pinning the crew into their seats released their grip entirely. These are the seconds we opened on, and this is the physics underneath them. With that grip released, a hand can move. It can reach a handle. The handle connects to the NACES, the Navy Aircrew Common Ejection Seat, built by Martin Baker. It is a 0-0 seat, certified to save a crew member at 0 altitude and 0 airspeed, sitting motionless on the ground, provided the aircraft is roughly upright. But its real intelligence is that it does not fire on a fixed timer. Milliseconds after the handle is pulled, an electronic sequencer samples altitude and airspeed and calculates how much rocket energy the seat needs to loft its occupant high enough for a full parachute before the ground arrives. There is no preset number to reach for. The seat is solving an equation in real time, in a sky that a collision had just rearranged. Most aviators go an entire career, thousands of flight hours, without ever pulling that handle. There is no rule-book limit on how many times a person may eject. The limit is biological. The human spine absorbs somewhere between 12 and 30 times the force of gravity in the fraction of a second the seat leaves the aircraft. A spine can take that once, perhaps twice. After that, the arithmetic turns against you. 4 handles were pulled. 4 sequencers read the sky and did the math. 4 canopies went, 4 rocket motors fired, 4 parachutes opened. 4 people reached the ground alive, while the emptied aircraft continued their fall and struck the earth, where the fuel that had stayed liquid the whole way down finally found the conditions it had been denied. Step back from the 3 systems, and the thing they share is not strength. Not one of them was strong enough to survive what happened. What they shared was a way of coming apart, gradually, in a predicted order, each one holding just long enough to pass the load to the next before it let go. Engineers have a name for that idea: defense in depth. Survival never rides on one unbreakable part. It rides on a series of parts that fail in sequence, each buying time for the one behind it. And you can watch the load travel down that sequence. The airframe held off its own collapse long enough for the fuel tanks to stay sealed. The sealed tanks let the escaping fuel scatter into the slipstream instead of pooling. The scattered fuel meant no fire in the air. The absence of fire gave the stall room to develop. The stall bled away the airspeed and the crushing load with it. And the instant that load lifted, 4 hands reached 4 handles, and 4 seats solved their equations before the ground arrived. No single link saved anyone. The chain did, and a chain is only ever as good as the order its links give out in. There is one more turn worth making. What set all of this in motion was not malice, and not really even error. It was closure rate. Two objects in the same air at slightly different speeds, and the blind geometry of a gap closing faster than any human could answer. Physics did not care that people were inside. But that same blindness runs both ways. The flashpoint of JP5 is just as indifferent. So is the collapse of lift in a stall. The engineers never beat physics. Nothing beats physics. They arranged it. They took the same uncaring laws that caused the collision and set them in an order that turned a catastrophe into something four people could walk away from. That is the craft of it. The difference between a wreck and a survivable one is almost never a single heroic part. It is the order in which the machine is allowed to break. We rank our machines by everything they do while they are working. Speed, range, the reach of a sensor, the weight of a payload. Those are the numbers on the brochure. The number that mattered most over Idaho was never printed there. It was the answer to the question a designer has to settle before any of the exciting ones. When this thing is destroyed, how much time can we give the people inside to leave? 2 Growlers are gone. Only around 170 were ever built, and the line that made them is closed. So in the plainest sense, they cannot be replaced. The 4 people who were strapped into them cannot be replaced either, because no one can. The difference is that they are still here, because 3 systems that were never designed for this failed in exactly the right order. So the next time you see footage of something that should have ended in silence and didn't, and someone reaches for the word miracle, ask the colder question instead. Not what saved them, but in what order things were allowed to break. The machines we trust with our lives are not the ones built never to fail. They are the ones built to fail slowly, in sequence, and in our favor. Subscribe to Classified Decoded. Physics does not deal in miracles, it deals in margins, and in the order those margins give out.